big billionaires of Silicon Valley. They dominate our social media, our communication, political discourse in a very significant way. There's a lot of people, psychologists specifically, that work for, the public relations industry or propaganda arms of governments, for example, or intelligence agencies that have studied very closely how to manipulate human behavior with technology. And I think when you consider that a lot of social media companies have their origins with intelligence, or if they didn't at the beginning, they certainly do now. And how they know that, the news feeds on social media can be used to manipulate people's emotions, or manipulate how people perceive events and reality. They leverage that. And to think they don't leverage that, I think would be really naive. So as an example, one that's sort of well-known and easy to find if you search for it online, is Facebook attempting to study how to manipulate people's emotions to make them feel more negatively, intentionally make them more depressed, by bombarding them with largely negative news on their news feed, right? And so, we can assume that they do that with all sorts of things and specific events. And when you consider the fact that we know now, and we've known for some time, quite frankly, that a lot of these companies, for example, selectively censor things, they're trying to cultivate the public's perception of events and reality and all sorts of different things. Social media and stuff like TikTok and all of that is having on people. It's not really talked about enough. And for those of us that lived a decent part of our lives without that stuff, it affects us differently than little kids that are exposed to that from extremely young ages. And how does that affect the brain? How does it affect socialization when all of that is still developing? I think a lot of that has had mostly negative impacts, and a lot of it doesn't get talked about. It gets normalized. Another big problem, though, that does come up a lot in my work is the role of how that data produced by all of this is harvested by intelligence agencies and then fed into AI, tied up with this blob of Silicon Valley national security stuff, because they really are fused. I mean, they're the private contractors for the intelligence agencies, and there's a lot of overlap at this point between them, but there's a lot of efforts to predictively or use AI predictively to see who's going to do what, or will this person commit a crime? Will this person do that before, this whole pre-crime paradigm and all of this other stuff. And we're seeing this trouble push to sort of define alleged misinformation online, treating that as cyber terrorism or a cyber crime. That online speech is, becoming criminalized. It's not just censoring, it's moving into that other sphere. So there's a lot of problems there. And so a lot of the people that own this technology that's having these other psychosocial impacts, negative impacts on humanity, are also controlled by a very centralized group that has very specific agendas. A lot of the Silicon Valley billionaires very interested in having very tight control over the U.S. Political system. I mean, they do in terms of political financing and stuff of both parties, and over our media, and just an insane amount of involvement with intelligence agencies, the military. As an example, former CEO of Google, Eric Schmidt, is funding major parts of the Biden administration right now. He's been a longtime big donor to the Democrats specifically, but he's basically been in charge of national security AI policy. He was the chair of the National Security Commission on AI. And if you read the book he wrote on AI with Henry Kissinger, he basically describes as his mentor on this stuff. It discusses a lot of these trends and talks about basically how AI is going to essentially, they don't call it a neo-feudal society, but they basically talk about how it's going to stratify society into two classes. And basically the people who program and maintain and direct the objectives of AI will be in one class. And then there's this large underclass that AI will act upon, and they won't understand what AI is doing to them. And they also say that people that become dependent on AI for decision making, for writing, for communicating, all sorts of stuff, will become cognitively diminished. And I mean, we can already sort of see it happening to an extent with how massive generative AI has become with GPT, for example. The whole idea that people have known for a long time, if you don't use it, you lose it. So, if you use you're a writer, for example, you use ChatGPT to write some stuff for you. Maybe you do it occasionally at first, but then you become dependent on it, and then you forget how to write without it. I mean, that's essentially what they're talking about. And it's Silicon Valley in bed with the national security state. It's like very overt and in your face. And the Silicon Tech, the big billionaires of Silicon Valley, they dominate our social media, our communication, in political discourse in a very significant way. They are a major force in campaign donations. They dominate our politicians in a very significant way. And like Eric Schmidt specifically too is like funding all these guys in the Biden administration and controlling the science and technology policy of the Biden administration, directly funding people in the government, which is totally illegal, but it's happening anyway. Like you can have Politico do like 3 exposés on Eric Schmidt doing that, and there's no accountability from like oversight offices in the government. They just don't do anything about it. They even tell Politico it's bad and nothing happens. I mean, that's mental. That tells you that we've like crossed the Rubicon, just people haven't realized it yet. Silicon Valley, which is making these products, has too much political power for regulation to even like make sense, really. So like as far as social media goes, there's like no actual discussion about like the psychosocial impacts, really. I mean, some of what you'll get is like fear mongering about like, oh, TikTok in China, but you have to keep in mind too that like a lot of TikTok executives at this point are like American, and they have like a lot of weird overlaps with like hiring NATO veterans and like one of the big guys at like Disney. It's not just like a CCP company. Like there's a lot of overlap. And even if you get on like an example, you have a lot of involvement of Steve Schwartzman of Blackstone Capital in China, like a lot of involvement. You have people like Elon Musk who have a lot of business connections to China. And he literally wants to turn Twitter, which he bought, into American WeChat. And, the parent company of like WeChat but like has a huge stake in Tesla and is like one of their most active shareholders. So, I mean, it's not, a lot of times you'll get like sort of this fear-mongering stance about it. And it's like, of course, like China probably does stuff like that, but they also obfuscate a lot of this other stuff that's going on at different levels that doesn't get discussed. Our government most certainly does all the same stuff that they accuse China of doing to Americans too. Oh, we're worried about TikTok only and the CCP and all of this, and then that's how regulation comes into being. It's not going to fix any of these problems. Like it's just a sort of like an opportunistic way for them to make it look like they're doing something, but really, our government will continue to do it to the American population, even if China is not, with their one app. And we have how many apps that are run by like cutouts of US intelligence operating social media right now?